Stage and film critic John Simon, interviewed by Mike Wallace of CBS News in New York on March 9th, 1978.
To begin at the beginning, and you've heard it a million times, but for whom does the run-of-the-mill film or theater critic write? For the audience, the actors, the writers, the directors, or...
Well, the run-of-the-mill reviewer writes for his editor's idea of the readership. Whatever his particular publisher and editor assume to be the readership's need, that is what he writes for.
So when you write for New York Magazine...
Well, I was saying the typical. I like to think that I'm not quite that. The other possibility is that you are a critic rather than a reviewer, someone who writes for himself, but that something you do amuses the editor or the publisher, and they assume that it would equally amuse or even, heaven help us, inform the readership, and in that case they take a chance on you even though you don't play ball with them.
In other words, you're the dwarf that entertains the emperor?
Yes,
on the New York Magazine. In other words, John Simon is a kind of vaudevillian.
Yeah, well, if you like, but the dwarf doesn't think of himself as a dwarf. He actually thinks that he has the soul of a giant and acts accordingly.
You write for yourself?
Yes.
And you like, obviously, what you write?
Yes.
And do you calculate the effect of what you write?
Not really, because if you're walking, you don't really calculate how long a step you're going to take or whether you put the right foot in front of the left or the left. You'd fall on your face if you did. You just walk. And that's the way I write.
One hears, correct me if I'm wrong, one hears that it is your ceaseless search for perfection that drives you to what some call critical excess.
Well, that may be so, but in that case... how wonderful for me if that's true. I'd like to think that's true because I don't really know what perfection is. I wish I did. But I do know, like Oliver Twist, that I'm hungry and that I want more. And if I want more, I say I want more. Sometimes I say what this more is. At other times I don't even know what it is. I just dimly feel it, but I try to describe it as best I can. And at least I can say where I'm left with hunger pains, and I describe those hunger pains as best as I can.
And apparently some of those hunger pains are very, very severe, because
they are.
You get fairly tormented by what you see, read, up there on a stage or a film or in a book.
Yes. I think many reviewers are lucky in that they really don't care very much about what they see, and that is why they're able to see one piece of garbage after another, day in, day out, and write sort of fairly polite, amiable reviews of that garbage. I can't do that.
So we're back to the run-of-the-mill critic or reviewer,
yes,
who simply is a hired gun.
Yes, and not even really a gun, a pop gun at best.
Now, there's a fellow by the name of Andrew Sinclair. You know who he is?
Yes.
Would you characterize him for us?
Well, first of all, he's a friend of mine, which is why he's probably going to say something slimy that you'll quote. Secondly, he's a bright man. He's a historian. He's a filmmaker. He's an Englishman. He is a wit. He's a novelist.
All right. Andrew Sinclair says, the good John Simon is learned, dedicated, witty, and determined to raise the level of cinema by the quality of his criticism. Yet the moment the good John Simon has his readers in a state of stimulated gratitude, the bad John Simon leaps onto the page in an explosion of squibs and graffiti, which is a euphemism for what you occasionally do to the people you begin to take apart.
And I'm supposed to comment on this, I take it.
You are.
Well, I think the good and the bad are not always separable. They make up something. I mean, for example, you couldn't have Swiss cheese without holes in it. Somehow you need the holes to make it authentic Swiss cheese. But speaking more seriously, there is a violence in me which is directed against what I consider ugly or stupid or a lie. And this sometimes takes a very sardonic, a very aggressive, a very spectacular form of expressing itself. which I think is all right, because we live in an age when people are not very sensitive. Otherwise, those reviewers we were talking about couldn't stand for the junk they have to see all the time. But insensitivity is the sort of the coloring of the age, and the only way you can pierce all that protective or maybe not protective coloring is by calling people's attention to the fact that a different opinion exists. And you can't do that by whispering. You can't do that by a polite little rap on the knuckles. You have to make yourself felt.
So you're taking your readership by the lapel, so to speak, and shaking them awake.
Yes, and of course there are sensitive souls left, thank God, and Andrew Sinclair may be one of them, to whom this is excessive and incomprehensible. But on the other hand, they have not been really in my line of work. Andrew writes an occasional book review, but he's not a regular movie or drama critic.
One of the objects of your occasional acerbic wrath is a fellow by the name of Joseph Papp, New York Shakespeare Festival. Joe Papp, New York Shakespeare Festival, and a fairly resourceful, imaginative producer.
Yes.
Well concealed, says Papp, well concealed under his intellectual cool, Simon's deadly feelers seek the vulnerable areas and hammer away with all the cunning cruelty he has developed over the years.
Well, what can I say? That's what Joe Papp says after I've given one of his shows a bad review. After I've given him a good review, he has his picture taken with his arms around my neck, not in a stranglehold, incidentally. So Papp is like so many other show business people. If you give them a good review, they love you. If you give them a bad review, they hate you, and they don't consider that that both are equally important or equally unimportant. Only one exists for them, the one that was the last.
Well, I looked through a lot of reviews that you wrote for New York Magazine and came up with one that you wrote fairly recently in New York Magazine. And I guess I'm really trying to understand why you do what you do in the way that you do it. We're talking about Devil's Disciple, George Bernard Shaw.
Yeah.
You are a big admirer of George Bernard Shaw. Therefore, you wanted to get a proper production.
Yes.
And the Brooklyn Repertory Company, is it B.A.M.?
B.A.M., yes.
Produces Devil's Disciple. The John Simon Review. Let's start with Margaret Hamilton, whose Mrs. Dudgeon is, if anything, worse now than it was some years ago in Cyril Richard's feeble Stratford, Connecticut production. Miss Hamilton, alas, was so great a success as the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz that she's been fixated into playing that part for the rest of her life, regardless of what a hapless playwright may have written. She hammers out Annie Dudgeon on the same acrid metallic note and is, as a musical instrument, rather more limited in range than a nutcracker. Furthermore, the actress is 75 years old and looks rather older than that, etc., etc. Now, it surely is entertaining. It may even be, by your standards, accurate. It is unmistakably cruel.
Well, you see, I think being a bad actress, and I think Margaret Hamilton is a very bad actress, not only in that part, in everything I've ever seen her in, except when she's playing a witch in a sort of silly Hollywood musical, then she's fine. But being a bad actress and being given important roles to ruin is to me a great crime. It is, of course, a collusion between the person who gives that part to the actor and the actor who is willing to play it. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get at the other culprit. I mean, it's hard to say whether it was the producer or the director or the casting director or somebody else. So you can, in a sense, the actor is unfortunate because he has to bear the brunt of two injustices that the critic is castigating, both his and his producers or directors, whoever. But other than that, I stand by every word I've written. I think she's a bad actress. She has no business being in a Shavian play. And if I knew who was responsible for having her in it, he would have gotten it just as much. And I think the director does get it somewhere along the line.
Oh, everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody.
And incidentally, the review does not begin with that, just for the listener's benefit. You said, for starters, I mean, it's for starters in your selection from the review, but there are other things that precede that paragraph.
Oh, considerable other things. And you
Right.
talk about the idea of a repertory company
Right.
growing in Brooklyn, being heartening, and so forth.
Right. So,
But then you wind up the review by saying, B.A.M. is the company. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, theater company. You destroy the company, the actors, the director, producer, the enterprise.
for that show, yes, but not for any future possibilities that they may have, which I express a hope for.
Now, the fact of, forgive me, the cruelty, that does not worry.
I don't see it as cruelty. I see it as truth, my truth, to be sure. But then again, I can't peddle anybody else's truth except my own.
Right.
What I see is that we live in a very permissive age in which a lot of other reviews are written by incompetents who have neither any confidence in their knowledge or opinions, and they're right, because they're not worth much, nor any guts, and who consequently write sort of tepid, silly, goody-goody reviews, which, of course, are very different from mine. What I'm saying is I'm not different from what the standard ought to be. I'm only different from what the standard is.
I'm almost reluctant to bring it up because it's been done, and I really don't want to go into it at great length, but you do seem to have a preoccupation with what you perceive to be physical shortcomings, be they breasts, noses.
Yes, not a preoccupation, but a concern, certainly. I think that, as I've said many times and as I've written many times, is that what happens on stage or screen is a complete aesthetic experience. And the actor contributes everything about him or herself to the event and is meant to do so. And one of those things is clearly his or her physique. Just as in a painting, if you said this is a wonderful painting but of a revolting subject, so you could say this is a good performer but with a revolting aspect that I don't want to look at.
And the willing suspension of disbelief just doesn't take over.
If the performance is great, it does. A great actor can afford to be a hunchback or a one-legged dwarf or anything, but it has to be a very great actor, and there are not that many of those, unfortunately.
Politics. When questioned about his politics, said Simon, none. Except when a man like Gene McCarthy comes along, then all out for him. Are you serious?
Yes, as I saw it then, I was. I mean, I probably was slightly misguided, but then politics, I never purported to be any kind of expert in politics.
And in McCarthy you saw what kind of Messiah?
Well, I didn't see any kind of Messiah, but I saw something that I think was really there. He was a cultivated, civilized, educated person who placed some importance on cultural and intellectual values, which seemed to be a refreshing change from your average presidential timber. The fact that he also had a terrible vanity and that he was seducible by people like Robert Lowell into becoming a poet rather than a presidential candidate was something I could not predict.
So you now suggest that you were probably wrong about Eugene?
Well, I was wrong to one very serious extent, in that no one is any good who cannot get himself elected. And obviously McCarthy, though I think he had very real virtues as well as failings, did not have that supreme virtue of becoming president. However, I think the public has to be blamed also, because I'm more and more convinced that whenever someone comes along who can use the English language correctly, who can sound as if he had a little genuine educational background, he immediately ipso facto eliminates himself from the running.
Mr. Simon, I was stunned in reading some material about you to find that you, of all people, are a joiner. You joined NON, National Organization for Non-Parents.
That's correct.
With this explanation, I know I have been a disappointment as a son. In the much harder part of father, I have every reason to expect an even worse performance from myself.
Yes, you know, that I don't consider that being a joiner. I consider that being a realist. I'm aware that my talents don't lie in that direction, and I think it's good for such people to abstain. It is also good to encourage other people with the same lack of ability to abstain likewise.
In other words, this is an extension of your criticism, except
Yes, in a different area, you might say.
you wrote about that Why I'm Childless in Harper's
Yes.
magazine, I guess, a couple of years ago.
Clever of you to have found it, I must say.
And as a result, or not as a result, prior to writing that,
Yes.
you had joined National Organization for Non-Parents.
By the way, their policy...
You've not backslid on that?
No, but they have. A new regime has come in that group, and it's much too soft, much too eager to please, willing to settle for zero population growth and Planned Parenthood and things like that. And I think the world is in much worse shape and needs far more stringent action, which the previous president, Ellen Peck, was very much concerned with. But the now management is less good.
Finally, you let drop, as we sat down, that you apparently do not watch television.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I must confess that I am a joiner in this field, because about 2.5 months ago I finally broke down and got a television set. But I'm very proud to say I've only seen about 8 hours of television in those 2.5 months.
How can you be proud if you've only dabbled or dallied for 8 hours with
Well,
television?
because, you go to friends' houses, and they have the set on, and you can't be rude about it, so you watch. And sometimes you want to watch a show that is interesting, because nothing can be bad all the time. And so you watch that, and it's not too bad, but then the set is on, and you keep watching the next thing, and the next thing is horrendous. So, plus you read reviews, plus your friends tell you things, and you get an opinion of things even without having spent your life observing them.
Why'd you finally buy a set?
Well, I bought a set because I was tired of seeing the 1 or 2 shows that I felt I had to see at the house of a friend who was 50 blocks away from where I live, so I figured it's perhaps a little more convenient to do it at home.
You rather enjoy this lonely, acerbic eminence that you have achieved in the world of the literati here in New York. Or is it literati?
Literati. And so, by the way, acerb is preferable to acerbic. Well, look, what can I say? One has to enjoy what one is. I mean, an elephant does not necessarily choose to be elephant any more than a camel chooses to be a camel. But you are a camel or you are an elephant, and you make the most of it, and you try to enjoy it. That's what contentment is all about. So I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg, being this way and then enjoying it, or enjoying being this way and then becoming it. But my guess is that it's in that order. You are what you are, and then you make the best and most of it.